Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, The Pathway to Zero Trust, your field guide to stronger cybersecurity, hosted by Fortinet. I'm your host, Jim Richburg, the field CISO at Fortinet who works with the public sector. As zero trust becomes a bigger part of government agencies' cybersecurity portfolio, organizations are looking for a roadmap on how to implement this often complicated process. Zero trust is a fashionable and often misunderstood term that means different things to different people, and different organizations are at different points in their implementation of it. Today, we're discussing zero trust networking access, its key concepts, and lessons learned from several government organizations that are already implementing zero trust. Today's discussion is divided into three parts. In the first part, I'll provide a few level setting comments. Then we'll go into an in-depth discussion with our speakers, and we'll end with interactive Q&A where you have the ability to ask questions live. But before we get started with the program, I'd like to point out the Q&A tab to the right-hand side of your screen, which allows you to ask a question. Feel free to submit those throughout the program. You don't have to wait until the end. I joined Fortinet after 34 years in the federal government, all of it spent in the US intelligence community, dealing with information that was often highly sensitive. Zero trust and its underlying principle of need to know was simply the default way we handled information at the CIA, where I spent most of my career. Zero trust is a concept that was largely created by and first implemented in government. So I think it's appropriate that I'm joined by two representatives from different parts and levels of government for this discussion. You'll hear about the similarities and differences in their challenges and successes in implementing zero trust for a US state and for the US State Department with an operating footprint that is literally global. I'm pleased to be joined on the virtual stage by Solomon Adote and Brian Moore. Solomon is the Chief Security Officer for the state of Delaware, and Brian is the Chief of the Perimeter Security Division at the Department of State. I'll ask each of them to describe themselves as we get into this discussion part of our program. So let me start with a bit of level setting. As I mentioned, the US government was arguably the pioneer in zero trust and has done a good job describing it in vendor and technology agnostic fashion. Probably the best one-stop reference on zero trust that I've found is NIST 800-207. In the discussion, I'd love to hear if Brian and Solomon have other go-to references that they could share. But I find it ironic that in my 18 months in the private sector, some federal agencies have been among the most skeptical in believing that current technology can actually deliver true zero trust operation. But from my perspective as a CISO for a Silicon Valley technology firm, and with a reasonably good understanding of the current state of the art in cybersecurity capabilities, I think the answer is yes. The combination of broad but granular visibility and near real-time control that are enabled by security platforms and AI machine learning driven data analytics is nothing short of transformational in its impact. This is especially true if you're talking about a greenfield from scratch build of a network, but that doesn't have to be the case. And frankly, the luxury of rip and replace is not the budgetary reality most of us face, which is why the core of this discussion will be about incremental implementation. I think the term zero trust carries a lot of baggage, especially for private sector organizations. As an aside, another loaded label that is relevant to this discussion is insider threat, which I think points us in unhelpful directions compared to a less pejorative and more accurate term like insider risk. Ask me about that in the Q&A window if you want more details. Zero trust does not mean people or assets are untrustworthy, more that trust is transactional, that it has a half-life, to use NIST's language, and even within a given connection or operating session, and that trust should not be based primarily on location, whether you're connecting from inside or outside the network perimeter. In the words of former President Reagan, don't trust by default and verify. Zero Trust describes a set of principles or paradigms for moving network defense from a static perimeter-based model to a focus on users, assets, and resources, most often but not always data. Authentication and authorization of both the user and the device are discrete functions that should be performed before allowing access to an enterprise resource. Zero Trust is about protecting resources, not network segments. In fact, Zero Trust assumes the network may already be penetrated and compromised. Zero Trust is fundamentally about visibility and control. It has a core set of functional elements: identity management and access control, an inventory of assets, the resources I keep mentioning, and an engine for policy decision and enforcement, often a firewall or an access device. And Zero Trust can be implemented dynamically, which can mean both operating in real time or operating not in real time, but adapting to changing organizational needs, such as the pivot to remote telework that all of our organizations did in March. But Zero Trust can also be implemented in static fashion. And it's funny, I've talked to many organizations that say they're not yet doing Zero Trust, but when asked, admit that, well, yes, they do have access controls, user IDs and passwords, that different classes of users, employees, contractors, and visitors, get different levels of access to the network. And yes, that their enterprise network is divided into segments. It's not a flat architecture, all of which are parts of Zero Trust operations. So I tell them, congratulations, you can stop agonizing over whether to adopt Zero Trust access. You've already started to implement it. But we've got a lot of ground to cover in this session, and our panelists have a lot of expertise. So let's dive into the discussion. And as I said, before I kick off the two questions, the questions, I'd like to welcome Brian and Solomon. So first, please, I'd like to have the two of you introduce yourselves. Let's start with Brian. Tell us something interesting about yourself, then tell us how you got to the job you have now.
Great. Well, thanks for having us this afternoon. Um, I've been with the State Department for 21 years now. 19 of those years, I served as the chief of the network design group. The last 2 years, I've served as the division chief for perimeter security. Prior to that, I worked with the United States Information Agency, and prior to coming into government, I was government contracting. So I have about 34 years of IT experience, um, where I started as a computer operator, I believe a job that doesn't even exist anymore. Then went to a programmer, and then fell in love with networking and figured out that was where my passion in IT was going to be. So I headed along the network and then network security path, and that brought me to where I am today.
Great. Solomon, what about you?
Wonderful to be here. Thank you very much. Wonderful to meet you again, Brian. I think a fun fact for me was that I actually started my career in aviation. I had a passion for the skies, I had a passion for flight, and I always saw myself in the air. But like most poor or broke students, I took the path of IT in a way to fund my flight habits, and it became a career. So I started off with system support, ended up in networking. I had the opportunity to support retail organizations, manufacturing organizations, and then government. And I'm loving the concept of government service. What's unique about government service is the ability to translate your efforts directly to citizen impact. When I help with Department of Labor, I can see a citizen that is in a situation that needs to file for unemployment. So that is what every day we take home, and that is what drives us every day. So I love that. When it comes to technology and zero trust, we actually started on the journey before we classified our journey as being related to zero trust. We had a mandate from our governor to provide a citizen experience that went beyond the traditional experience. And traditionally, you line up or you hunt for information from your government. He wanted a better way. He wanted a way for us to take the information to the citizen. And to achieve that, we had to look at our network architecture. those applications that were behind the counter that you had to walk around in DMV now had to be on somebody's phone, now had to be out there in the world. That means our architecture that was built on tall and big and thick walls was no longer effective because we had to put the data out there. And we started off with the concept of identity as a core of our program and evolved from there in using identity to drive our zero trust model. So I'm really excited to talk about our journey and to learn a lot about how other people have been more successful here.
Well, thank you, both of you. And Solomon, certainly given the huge budgetary shortfall, the fiscal free fall that state and local government are in because of COVID, I think things like zero trust, as you extend digital services to citizens, are going to be increasingly important. So I really look forward to hearing from you about that. So let's kick right off into the questions, guys. Zero trust is really an operating principle and a philosophy, and it just says it's a set of paradigms in their guidance. So it can mean different things at different agencies. So I'd like to hear first from both of you what zero trust looks like in your organizations. So up to you, who goes first?
Okay, I'll go ahead and start. So I think I can answer this question in two parts. One is where we are today and along our zero trust journey, and then how we define zero trust in the end state and what we're shooting for. So I think we are not unique and in the same position I think that you spoke of earlier, Jim, where most people are kind of along a zero trust journey without realizing they're along a zero trust journey, right? So we do have some enclaving in place where we have some micro perimeters in limited areas for very high valued assets, but not generally for segregating all of the different assets through the network. We have access control in various places. It's been implemented for things like sanity checking on the network to ensure that subnets that shouldn't be talking in certain areas are blocked. We have also to go on through and ensure that we have access control at a major perimeter where we have our traditional moat and castle firewall situation. The utopian state and where we're headed and how we define zero trust, it's really all about the data. The data is king. The data is the thing to be protected. Whereas in the current models, when you look at things, it's protect the network, right? So everybody, for years, the philosophy was you build up a strong wall, you put walls around the entire network. But once you got into the network, so you went through all this credentialing or all these complicated rules and devices, once you were in, it's free reign. So you could go anywhere, you could do anything. The trust was out the window because you were trusted because you already got in. So because you're in, you're fully trusted. You can go and do anything you want. Um, that is, that outdated thinking is what's gotten a number of agencies and private industry in trouble. So the way that we define zero trust and where we're going in a utopian state is forget about the network as being the security layer. It's not that you don't want to do some security network, you do, but the network is not going to be the end all be all security layer. It's really going to be about protecting the data, protecting the identity and the data. So as the data flows through its life cycle, through the network from the user, from the asset to the user to another asset, not only is it protected in some sort of an encryption or some separation of some sort from the regular other traffic, but it's also positive trust. So every type of connection is for a specific need that that individual has, that entity, because it could also be not a person, but it could be a device. Whatever that needs to access a certain asset has to, at that specific time, have the specific need to get to that asset, um, and based on a risk profile that they have to meet, that continued access, even if they are supposed to have it, would be granted or pulled. So having a continuous risk-based posture assessment of the identity, the person, the item, whatever that it is, would be calculated on an ongoing real-time basis. And in the event that while you were trusted to access a specific asset in your role, if suddenly you're doing something impossible travel or something that within the rules that we have set up that's identifying you to have more risky behavior that reaches a specific threshold, at that point your access could be moved down to a different zone where you don't have access, for instance, to the crown jewels. You only have access to the general mail and SharePoint type infrastructure, or maybe only internet only if you're really risky. So that's in a nutshell, kind of that's where we view zero trust, is that everything is based on a positive connection. It's not just you can go to anything you want just because you have a user ID and it gives you rights to it, but it's also monitored with telemetry, real-time posture assessment, and again, every single connection would be in and of itself protected.
Thanks. What about you, Solomon?
And Brian eloquently communicated where we're trying to go too. What we identified that it was never about the network, right? It was only about the network when we focus purely on legacy applications. Legacy applications are still a problem we're all addressing, we're all working through. But when you abstract that, you realize that it came down to the application that delivered the data. So we've been evolving our models on looking at how do we take that same system and make it available from anywhere, at any time, and any device. And you start to realize that you can do the same internally too, that the network access was not necessarily required. So that started to evolve our concept of implementing our network architecture. Some call it microsegmentation, but to us, one device doesn't have to trust another one just because they exist in the same network, same VLAN, the same control plane. When you start to think about that, you realize that it comes to authenticating the identity, and identity is critical, core foundation of what we want to achieve. Authenticating the device, and not just that the device is managed, but the health of the device. And then making a decision at that point whether the system they need to access should be allowed. And that is very important, because if the health of the device is not up to par or the user cannot be validated, you want to be able to make the decision in real time on whether they can access a particular application. Not and we like to go beyond just logging into the application, the ability to interact with the web service of the application, the connection into the application. So that's where we're evolving to, where each device exists on its own island and has access to whatever it's approved to access. If we both sit together, that doesn't mean I need to be able to talk to you. You don't have to talk to me. We're all here to consume a service, and that's what we will consume. So we've been building out our foundation of identity. We've been building out our foundation of controlling the access to the application and the ability to validate the health of a device in order to provide that access. And that's what we're driving towards.
So between you, you've already hit most of the checkboxes there in NIST 800-207. We've talked about identity. We've talked about, basically continuous assessment. When Brian was talking about the status quo ante networks, I was reminded of maybe a generational thing. We used to talk about Tootsie Pop network defenses, hard and crunchy on the outside, soft and chewy on the inside. And once you got through that outer shell, you were home free, because it was all based, that's really what it was based on. So I had a question. How has your thinking about zero trust changed as a result of COVID? The current telework environment, the mass pivot that we've made, and then Brian's in an organization where they already had a global footprint. So was it different in the field versus at headquarters? So you're on screen, let you go first, Sol. But how, if at all, has COVID affected your thinking of or implementation of zero trust in the state?
I think COVID independently reinforced the need for zero trust. What you realize in most environments, their organizations were never designed to work externally. We had a set of users that might need to work at night or might need to be able to work externally, but they were a limited team. So we didn't have everybody with a laptop. We didn't have everybody with a state asset. And now you had to take them home and give 20,000, 21,000 or more people access to corporate data and corporate systems. And that's where we had to accelerate our development of zero trust, at least from an identity perspective, so we can have a single perspective across all the technologies we provide. And we looked for opportunities where we didn't have to bring you in to access a particular application. can we make that application already available to you with the necessary controls to make sure our data is not leaving and we're not losing control. So we had to accelerate our authentication, our ability to positively authenticate you to each application, the ability to authenticate your device, and ability to give you services based on those two. And it was important for us to classify that it wasn't, some people say I have a single sign-on solution. It's not the single sign-on solution we were after. We were after intelligent, identity-aware, threat-aware authentication sources that could go across the plane of technologies we were offering. So I would say that COVID really accelerated our plans, and it also provided some opportunities to be more aggressive with change management. To take something that would take a year to get everybody to love it and everybody to go to it. We're like, I got to give you access now. Here's how you will be accessing it. And our users were actually appreciating the new way of delivering that services. So we definitely have appreciated that aspect of COVID's delivery.
Okay, Brian, what about at State Department?
Yeah, so wow, COVID. So I think that part of the tech staff is still trying to catch up on sleep. We we went from an on-prem, largely on-prem organization that had some remote access to a almost wholly remote workforce overnight on a system that we originally had scaled for about 40% of our workload, and suddenly 100% needs to now telework around the globe. So there was a Herculean effort across multiple groups within State Department to beef up the IT infrastructure to be able to handle the telework, from the bandwidth that was needed to the actual firewall capacity, down to the services that actually provide the remote telework services. So we had to tackle things like remote administration, which we weren't allowing previously, through a mobile solution that now we had to find a way to do that because people couldn't do their jobs. If you're in an administration role, if you're in an engineering role, you can't actually do your job now. So from a response perspective, it was a huge amount of effort to go through and build this infrastructure. Now, from a zero trust perspective, I think what it did was it kind of changed some thinking a little bit. And what I mean by that is, in the past, I think the way it was viewed is that a remote worker was coming off your hardened infrastructure and they were kind of an appendage off your network, right? They came in from some outside entity at home or whatever, and you just kind of worked out there. And I think what people came to realize when COVID hit and the workforce went largely remote, it suddenly, wait a second, that is now also the perimeter, right? That the remote user is part of the perimeter, which is one of the key pieces of zero trust, right? Is you have perimeters everywhere. There's no longer the castle walls being your only perimeter. Now the perimeter is around any of the data, any of the access points, and the way people are accessing the data itself. You have perimeters now. So I think it really changed the mindset to really reinforce the zero trust principles of the micro perimeters and the fact that the perimeter is really everywhere, including the cloud.
Okay, there's one other part of the pivot to remote telework that from my perspective, see, and as a public sector CISO, I work with state and local government coast to coast, so I've really felt the pain, in all corners of this country. And I think the part that is underappreciated is we thought through how to secure the headquarters end, whether it was the enterprise, its data center, or the cloud. We typically said, the price of admission is going to be having multi-factor authentication to the far end and encrypting the connection back. But the reality is we are now allowing our remote users to work in an environment that we have, to use the zero trust terms, no visibility into and even less control over. You don't know. I mean, how many of your home users know how to change the passwords on their devices, much less flash the BIOS? So here we've gone into a position of infrastructure that's all run in its default unpatched configuration, with all sorts of crazy things happening from other users in that environment. Anybody who's raised teenage kids knows what I'm talking about. So even if you say, I think I can isolate the workload of my device, you're not 100% sure. So this is really putting us in a premium. That's why I keep coming back to say, don't trust what's going on there. And in your implementation of zero trust, either at the state level or for the department, Are you doing things like doing SSL inspection of what's coming upstream? Because again, part of zero trust is, I validated, I've done the handshake, the device is right, the user's right, the geo coords, it matches the pattern of activity, but do I really know what's riding back in that encrypted pathway? Thoughts on that?
I can speak to that. And I would say depends on the technology that you're using. We've had a particular posture for a while now, but what we had to do was to terminate our connection before access to the data in order to look into the data, right? And I know we're always looking to evolve into to leverage the capabilities which we already own to inspect the data roll in flight when we're terminating the VPN. But for us, what we've had to do was terminate it in like a demilitarized zone and then get to look at the packet before we encrypt it and send it back. So we definitely believe in that concept. What is most scary for us is to have part of the data, right? Especially when it's an unmanaged asset where we have part of the data, we know what the DNS call was, we know what the traffic coming to us is, but what else is happening in that asset? And it's really been a scary thing for us. So when we talk about increasing the velocity of which we deliver zero trust, we had to quickly change how we did VPN. That it wasn't about access to the networks, about I'm going to give you a desktop and that's about it. Or I'm going to give you this app and that's about it, which not all our users were ready for. They had to adapt to it because we're used to, I go to start and then I click here and that works. But the COVID environment enabled us to do that. So definitely we were expecting the traffic, but the challenge of still seeing half the traffic is always there. And we'll continue to fight that.
That's the whole thing about stateful versus stateless versus third gen firewalls. But I mean, one of the experiences I had working with people across the country was it takes bandwidth. It introduces latency to do that kind of inspection. And especially as we surged and the pipes were of a certain size and the ports were limited, sometimes you found the network operations people were turning that off simply because they needed, they couldn't introduce that kind of latency. The throughput was going down too much. So this was one where I said, this really puts a premium on security and operations, network operations, having a conversation to say, look, I get that in March we may have had to do that simply because we had to get the users up and functioning. But if we're still running, if me on the security side think we're doing full packet inspection and you on the network side go, we turned that off 6 months ago and you haven't bought more capacity, that's a conversation that needs to happen.
No,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that balancing act of the performance and the security is always a knob you're turning left and right, right? So it always one suffers the other one as you adjust. And at state, we've been doing the inspection of the SSL traffic at the edge for a number of years. So having to now adapt that construct internally to be able to also then inspect internal traffic as it traverses between assets. That's something we know that's along our zero trust journey that we're going to have to do in order to enable that telemetry that we were talking about so that you can do that risk-based posture assessment.
Right. Right. Well, Brian, your remarks start getting me into the next question, which would be, so I think we're convincing people that zero trust is a paradigm we're thinking about, that it gives you a lot of benefits. So let's talk about the steps you took in your organizations to actually start down the path of implementation. Yeah, how did you approach this in terms of your thinking, and then what were the baby steps, the first things you did, and recommendations you might give to some of these other organizations?
Right. So I think as like a lot of people, if you really start to understand zero trust, and especially the definition, the way that we defined it, I think the first thing you do is you take a step back and you look at it and you go, oh my God, this thing is so huge. It's so expansive. How in the world are we going to be able to get to the end state? Right. So one of the things that we did initially was we conducted an offsite where we looked at targets of opportunity. We looked at how to think really big, but start small, to turn around and really define to ourselves while there is definitions of zero trust out there, what definition was it that we were going to embrace so that we could articulate to management, everybody would be on the same page. So once we did that, we started to look at how we could build a program around that, because it's really a set of projects that you have to build into a program framework in order to be able to get to the end state, right? So what we did was we deconstructed the larger program down into individual projects, and then we sought to get funding for specific projects that could get the foundational pieces up and running. As I said earlier, one of the things we had already started was the enclaving of the high valued assets. So the next logical progression for us was to look at NAC, the network access control, which we're calling network admission control, because we're kind of taking it to another level with a zoned access approach. But moving forward in a way to ensure that rogue devices aren't actually getting on the network to start with, and ensuring that we positively identify all the assets that are on the network, and doing it as part of the zero trust principles. It's positive engagement. That device has to be trusted to be even part to participate as part of the network, as one of the first layers. So we're actively working on the NAC project right now to start with the device piece. We also continue to beef up our identity management. We've been working on that for a number of years with Okta, and then the Azure products to really beef up the way we're doing identity management. That will continue to grow through the cloud as well as on-prem. So we kind of broke it down these projects, but that's kind of our journey, was to make sure you thought really big, look at the big picture, but really start small, break it down into your targets of opportunity where we can actually make headway with specific customers with specific needs, and then build from there.
So before Solomon goes, I think to paraphrase, to sort of simplify that, would be look for low-hanging fruit. I mean, find quick wins that'll show value, and define the goals. I mean, we can say, it's one thing to say zero trust is a marathon, but if you can say, on the other hand, if we call it a 10K, the finish line is going to come a whole lot sooner, and it will still have value add. I mean, that's a caricature, but you know, I think you're right. It's about defining your goal. So Solomon, how about in Delaware?
For us, we were still on that journey. Just as Brian said, we started with identity. We felt it was important for us to have a single perspective on authentication, authorization, and accounting. When you're a state organization that is basically formed from taking about 32 different independent entities and bridging them into one organization, you can understand the similarities and the differences in all the technology involved. And then we also, as a state, have a lot of technology debt because we've evolved over time, and we're penny pickers, right? We spend very little, only when we have to, because we're very conscious of citizen funds. So we do have a lot of the technology debt. So our focus was first to solidify our foundation, which was identity, and two, to start isolating the applications away from the users. So network segmentation of our applications away from an intranet, away from a local network, was very key for us to do, and to get into the concept of delivering an application rather than a connection to a server. So the abstracting the network communication ports and just delivering an application through either a web application firewall or reverse proxy. So our users get used to not actually interfacing with the server or with the server. So when we move the server, they don't know it. They just know I'm just talking to an application. So that has been our path. And what we're doing for the microsegmentation area is using the local host firewalls to be able to say that I will talk to my default gateway, I'll talk to networks outside, but I will not talk to my local network as a starting point. So we're monitoring a lot of these. Some of them we're already blocking, where it doesn't accept connections from around itself. So it's a slow process, but we're making a lot of wins. And the more we deliver through these application delivery mediums, the more our users start to forget how they used to access those applications. And they get used to the new way that it's more versatile. Now I can deliver that application from anywhere at any time on any asset. I can validate that, hey, you're on a personal device, I'll virtualize to you. You're on a state asset, I would deliver the application directly to you through a reverse proxy. I validate the asset and the user. So we're excited where it will take us. And you hate to see it, but we're looking forward to the death or the demise of VPN slowly as we evolve out. Even though we know the capability will still have to exist for other purposes to minimize that open access to the corporate network or that tunneling into the corporate network, into our state network.
Okay, so I want to ask a follow-on question that'll build on things that both of you guys have said. So, are there certain kinds of infrastructure or technology? Solomon, you talked about technology debt, the deficit, or Brian, certain kinds of information that are either necessary or make it easier to start your zero trust journey. And what I mean, for instance, did you notice there are certain things you're strapped for money that you could put something in like a next-gen firewall that actually is multi-purpose and allows you to say, I updated lots of my infrastructure in one fell swoop? Or Brian, you talked about starting with high-value assets. I mean, what are your tips about, here's either a starting position that, gives you quick momentum or helps you validate where you're going? And what are your thoughts on that, guys?
So I would say that the first tip I would give people is start where you are. There is no roadmap or playbook that says you must have this as a precondition to start your zero trust journey. It just doesn't work like that. Everybody needs to take a deep breath. Wherever you are is okay to start from there, and you can build on it. So it's going to be unique to every organization of where that starting point is and what they've got available to them. But I think everybody has those targets of opportunity of the type of equipment that they have and the way they've implemented it. And as you said earlier, it's very possible they've already started implementing parts of zero trust and just didn't call it zero trust. So take the credit for what you've already started and build on that. The second thing I would advise is the most important thing is the data. If you do not understand where your data is going, if you don't understand who is accessing what, for what purpose, under what conditions, you're going to have a very difficult time taking your zero trust journey to the utopia state. You can implement different pieces and parts of zero trust, but it's all about the data. So, coming up to speed with whatever tools that you have, take advantage of any AI, telemetry, anything that you can get your hands on to really understand the data flows. And you don't initially have to understand the data flows of the entire network. Pick an application to start. That's perfectly fine, but just start somewhere. Try to understand the total way that the data flows and who's accessing what roles need to access it at just in time for this, when they don't need those types of access. So you can start to build a behavior pattern of when users need to access, and entities, because it's also devices, are accessing various assets under what conditions. And from that, you can gain a true understanding, and not just like you said before with the Tootsie Roll analogy or the Tootsie Roll Pop, where it's, in the old days, it's the hard, crunchy outside, but then it's the Wild West on the inside. Now it really forces people to have to understand why is this person accessing this data and under what conditions, and when should they not be accessing that data. Once you understand that, then you can really holistically look at the ecosystem that you're trying to build, and then start building on what infrastructure you have, and then take advantage of different projects and technology implementations that you can build in a logical fashion to keep building on your success and just continue to have iterative success towards your goal.
And I'm going to jump in here for a minute. I think when you say you, Brian, I think this is one of these aha moments, and why I sometimes push back on federal agencies who call this mission impossible. I say this as a former spy, and that's that the AI. You mentioned AI and ML. This is a game changer because we're generating lots of big data now in instrumenting our networks. I helped run the CNCI, which was the national whole of government, thing that we tried 10 years ago. It generates a ton of data. Well, what has increasingly gotten mature? AI and ML for big data analytics. So that ability, you talked about characterizing the data flows. UBA, we've talked about that, user and entity behavioral analytics. This is tailor-made, not for human beings, for computers, for these kind of algorithms that are getting increasingly powerful, increasingly effective at being able to characterize normal network activity, and therefore to know what abnormal activity looks like, to know what's abnormal and just aberrant and you want to watch it, and what's abnormal in a neural network, a sort of a deep neural network that's real fast, like sub-second, it's saying on balance, this is bad. It's the same way your ancestors could say something growled in the night and roared. I don't have to count and say, well, is this a saber-toothed tiger or a giant cave sloth? My neural network said exit stage left. This is one where technology in the form of AI and ML is really, really our ally in being able to characterize and implement. But Solomon, anyway, sorry, over to you.
I think simply one of the key statements I make to my team and my colleagues is that cybersecurity comes down to, for me, is two things: visibility and control.
Yeah.
And, to achieve zero trust, that level of control might take you a little bit. It might take you a lot. It might take you a lot of investment, but at least start with your visibility. And visibility it's about not just logs. It's important to make sure you have the logs, but to generate the right type of logs. When you talk about visibility in local network, the unified threat management systems, the ability to be able to look into the logs when traffic is traversing between systems, between networks, in and out of your organization to the internet. Visibility is key as a way to understand what is going on in your environment, to be able to strategize on how to implement your controls. Because a lot of times we catch ourselves investing a lot of resources to protect an application used by 10 people. And you get out there, and when you're done, you're like, what was the overall impact on my overall risk profile? And it was limited because you didn't have visibility. So visibility and control, if control is low, ramp up your visibility. And eventually you want to get them all to be equal between visibility and control. But if you cannot implement visibility for one reason or the other, then you have to jump to your controls and be effective with your controls. So being able to think about that way, make sure you have the right devices that are giving you the right visibility. It doesn't matter if it's SSL traffic, and you made a very profound statement that a lot of CISOs are struggling with right now, which is the concept of performance being an impediment to security, where the functionalities are being turned off, and it's a battle between teams. You have organizations that now are forming network security teams that are under the security office to ensure that security is getting priority when it comes to these types of implementations, because the visibility in these devices are very key. And I think when we have the visibility, when we can prioritize the high value assets, the high traffic assets, and we start from there, our customers start to see the value right away. It's very unique to implement a security control and have a customer or user come to you and say, yeah, I really appreciate that. That was a better experience for me. So we're not only achieving security, we're achieving a user experience that I believe is critical to your success. I tell my team every day, if you make the password 200 characters, you did not become more secure. That means you just give them a right to write it down. So how do you evolve while maintaining user experience? The user experience, we consider it as critical, and is written even our security strategy to provide a transparent or translucent working experience as we enforce the security controls. So you put that together, you'll have a path forward to achieve it.
So you hit on something that, I used to run national counterintelligence and security, and we used to say when security and convenience clash, convenience is always going to win. And a slightly more abstract way to say that now, and this, here you are at the state level, your resources are in free fall. Organizations are going to circle the wagons to preserve core mission for whatever department they are in. Support services like security, especially, become a convenient place to absorb risk, because if I don't do it, my life is actually, there are things I don't have to do. And until the breach happens and the finger pointing starts, we become an especially attractive target. And that's traditionally the way rounds of budget cut work. But we're in a different place with the pivot to COVID, because this is the one time in my memory of doing this for 35 years that IT, certainly, and security to a lesser extent, we were the spear carriers. I mean, we were instrumental in our employees going from having to be sent home to sit on their hands for 6 months to being up and running. So this is the first time you have senior executives excited about IT, not as a support service, and sometimes security, because they have applications that they would not have been legally or by policy been able to use if we not been able to say, here's a security fix to allow that. So we got to think creatively, because the budget cuts are only going to get worse. We need to find ways to spend smarter, not more. And that goes beyond zero trust, but zero trust is certainly a component in how we think about doing this going forward. So
exactly.
jump
When we
in.
talk about authentication and identity management, it wasn't about giving them another multi-factor solution. It's about telling them that the same multi-factor solution that you're using now goes across all your applications. And even better that you can accept it right on your phone and be like, really? I can do that? I'm like, yes. What is key for me is validating that it's not somebody else pretending to be you, not to make your life difficult. And those are the things that we're achieving by leveraging the partnerships that we have with the technologies that we have.
I mean, my experience, and Brian, feel free to either weigh in on whatever state's perspective was, that where different federal agencies were on the pivot and the difficulty or ease with which they implemented it was, if not random, it was very much a function of where they were in their technology upgrade path. There were some who had just upgraded the right parts of their infrastructure to say, all I need to do, to Solomon's point, is tell people to download soft token multi-factor authentication, and we're off to the races. We're up and running. We have the bandwidth, we have the security, we have everything else. And there are others who were trying to put 10 pounds of flour in a 2-pound sack because they just didn't have the right hardware, the right connections, the right policies. And, as hard as they struggled, they were just, and it wasn't that you necessarily had an enlightened security and IT staff at one and not at the other. It was just where you were in your upgrade cycle. I mean, does that sound familiar, Brian, or am I just channeling
No, I
other
mean that that
agencies?
that absolutely I think resounds across the federal government.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to close out our roundtable part, and we've got at least one question. People start thinking of other questions to put in. As we close this roundtable part of the talk, I'd love to have you each give one practical piece of advice. You've already given a lot in the course of our book, but single out one thing that you would tell the audience as they start down this journey of zero trust. What's one thing they could do that'll help facilitate their start?
Hmm. I'll let you
Uh,
go, Brian.
Okay. Um, so yeah, I think the one piece of advice I would have is you really have got to define to yourself what zero trust means to you, and you have to do it in a way that hits multiple layers, right? So you have to be able to articulate it to the highest parts of senior management in a business construct and a security construct that they understand, as well as to the common user what it means to them. The application developers need to understand this new change in the paradigm, and your security folks as well as your information assurance folks, everybody has to understand that this is not the way things have been in the past. This is a completely different mindset. It's a different culture. It's a different whole ecosystem. It's not a system. It's not a system. It's not a product. It's not a service. It's all these pieces coming together, and it takes a different way of thinking things until you get everybody on board with that. And it is a challenge. I'm not sure I think sometimes we think we have everybody on board, and then something will come up, and you'll realize, again, everybody's still not the same mindset. You have to continually keep working this. And that's because there's a lot of, I think, competing information that's out there. When you start talking to vendors, especially, then it gets terrifying because every vendor's got a zero trust product. Boom, just buy this, and away you go. You got zero trust. And people hear that at these trade shows, and then they think it's a product. They think it's just you buy this, and suddenly you have zero trust. And again, what you really got to kind of define what it is, and then find a way to articulate it in a way that all the different levels through the organization, from the user all the way up to senior management, understand how it works, how it fits, and how it makes you more secure.
And before Solomon goes, I think you're right. It's in one sense, it feels like this is the equivalent of saying AI enabled in front of something. A few years ago, AI
Right.
became the buzzword where you could sell the AI enabled diet, for crying out loud. Just
Yeah.
it was the fad. And I really come back to saying I think the term itself doesn't help us because zero trust somehow denotes things like judgments about people being untrustworthy. If we just called it, look, this is an extension of defense in depth. That's where you talk to the organizations that say, I'm doing segmentation, I'm doing this stuff. And, I do think this label at one level has not been helpful because it starts implying either paranoia or my people are not trustworthy, not something about
Right.
continuous
And I'll tell
validation.
you, I mean, one of the ways I've tried to help explain it to people is don't think of it as completely zero trust. What you need to think of it is it's a zero trust of baseline. You get dynamic trust as you need it in your role for whatever it is you're doing at that time. So you're trusted if you're trusted and should be trusted under that specific role or whatever that you're doing. But then when you're just free ranging, you shouldn't be trusted just to go anywhere. And do you really want your neighbor to be fully trusted to go and start reading your HR files or whatever? No, you don't want that. I mean, human nature wants to have segregated trust, right? So it's not a foreign concept, but I think when people hear the term zero trust, they get very confused. And I think some people do get offended by it and think that what you're saying is, wait a second, I have a security clearance. You're saying you don't trust me now? Well, I'm not trusting you to get to a specific asset if you shouldn't be going to that asset. So if you have a proven need for that, you'll get dynamically allocated that trust for that period of time to fulfill that role, and then you won't. And it's just more of an escalation of trust up and down versus just a straight line zero trust. So I think when people hear it in that kind of context, it makes a lot more sense. They don't feel so defensive about it.
I mean, the way I break it down, and then I'll let you go, Solomon. I want you to talk. Is we talk about it needs to be done per transaction, in per session, and this builds on your example, Brian. I mean, I think you can say within my organization, I probably ought to have access to the email addresses to anybody in the organization because I could very easily have a business need to send them something. Well, at the other end of the scale, when it looks at payroll records, unless I'm a finance officer, and even then it should be bounded by post or bureau. You only want me looking at my own pay records. You don't want me looking at anybody else's. Zero trust does not mean, to your point, Brian, free range. I have a clearance. I'm an authorized. I'm a validated user, so I can go look at anything from crown jewels to HR. If you put it that way, people go, well, of course not. We go, right. So what I'm telling you is not something alien to your thinking. So Solomon.
I would say, one of the deliverables coming out of your initiative, if you are implementing zero trust, is to reduce your blast radius. Fundamentally, start off by reducing the blast radius a little bit every day. And if you can do that, you're on the right path. So whether it is leveraging network access controls, network access control solutions to mitigate the trust of the devices near you, start to reduce your blast radius. So the point where the blast radius is one device, it's one compromise, and keep it at that one compromise so you have enough time to respond and protect your environment. Simplify your delivery. It's not about 15 different technologies, it's about the right technology. Make the right investment. And when you're making an investment, you can have the best of breed to perform this function, the best of breed to perform that function, the best of breed to perform that function. Each one of the consoles comes with somebody else to support it. And its implementation and all the work that comes with that, which takes away from the ability to get value out of the solution itself. So simplify your environment. I think the best thing to ever happen to network security was the unified threat management system. For the ability for me to open a packet once and perform my analysis from IPS to anti-malware to application profiling all in one and close out the packet and send it on its way. Those are the things that you invest in. Whether you're doing a remote access, when you terminate, inspect there. Don't wait to inspect down the line, because what you catch yourself doing is inspecting SSL traffic that, one, is more resource intensive, and two, you've probably seen part of the traffic, not all of it. So the user experience matters. Don't go down this path and complicate your user's life. Make the transitions transparent to them. Give them a more enhanced way of accessing the application. So when you move the server, they will not notice it. You can fight the battle with the application developers, you can fight the battle with the systems engineers, but for the users, keep their experience top notch and as effective as possible. Yes, they'll have to go through a transition process. Yes, they are not going to be fans of change, but at the end of the day, can they say they had a better experience than when you began and you're more secure? So, right type of technology. And when it comes down to it, you want to get the right visibility for your security operations center. I tell all my teams, whether you're application security, network security, or risk management or something like that, are you generating the right type of data for the SOC? Because if your technology is making the SOC blind, you're defeating our purpose. So when you put it in, get the right visibility to the SOC, and the SOC has their AIs and the machine learnings to be able to effectively respond to threats against the state. So hopefully that does help somebody out.
So there's only one question so far. We're going to keep talking because I think we can hit that one question fairly quickly. But something you were talking about blast radius, Solomon, and that raised in my mind. Clearly, you want to assume the network is already compromised, and therefore you minimize. As a former attacker, the first thing you did when you successfully penetrated is you had to do that. The good news is I'm in the network. Between high fives each other. The bad news is where the heck am I? You know,
Yeah.
what is it connected to, and is there anything interesting here? We don't know that.
That,
From my perspective, one of the other useful things about zero trust is it's threat agnostic in the sense that it would work against an insider problem, it would work against an outsider problem. And since increasingly outsiders come in with credentialed access, we're now using that UBA that we talked about, you know, the user and entity behavioral analytics. So it really doesn't care whether this is somebody on the inside misbehaving or maybe even just making a mistake, being a human being, or if it's somebody who's come in from the outside, whether as a partner or whether with employee, you know, credentials. Yeah, a zero trust paradigm and tools should work against either. I mean,
yes,
does that make sense?
it definitely does. And you know, as we evolve, one of the things that we keep looking at is, you know, the one fundamental factor that we've relied on for years is Active Directory. So that is another area that, you know, you have to pay some attention to. How do you reduce the reliance on Active Directory? Because it could end up being the backdoor into all your environments and the backdoor to your microsegmentation. So when we invest in identity management solutions, we're invested in solutions that can eventually assume some of the role of the directory stores and limit the directory stores to effective authentication. You know, whether it's your cloud storage and all those types of factors, limit the binding activities and the binding systems in your environment.
Right.
Right. And, you know, as you were saying, you really want to build this environment where when if somebody is in the network, it isn't so, but it's kind of so. So what? They're in the network. What are they
Yeah.
going to see? Well, if it's done in a true, fully deployed zero trust environment, nothing really, because you're just kind of traversing around a highway. You've got no off ramps. You can't go anywhere. You can't see anything. There's zero horizontal movement. So you're just riding around the beltway. You can't do anything, and not go ahead, stay on the beltway all day long if you want to. Now, we're going to want to evict that individual. We don't want him to hang out there forever, but the damage that he can do, that they can do now with the horizontal movement. So it isn't necessarily the penetration that's the problem. It's the horizontal movement once the penetration has occurred. That's what zero trust stops. I mean, that ensures that you just have all these protected areas that just nobody on the main network can do anything, get to anything, and they just float around until they're caught and evicted.
And as an Intel guy, I might actually learn something interesting watching him try to find off ramps somewhere. But
Absolutely.
let's make sure we address the one question that came up. So you know, look at the Q&A thing. I think we may have already touched on this in our conversation, but does implementation of zero trust have a unique cost that would be new, or that you know is in addition to things you would already be doing? I mean, what have your experiences been? Is there a separate zero trust bill, or is this simply largely derivative of things you're already implementing either in technology or policy?
I think you can also consider it as just technology reinvestment. It's deprecation of other technologies. You know, if it's the next upgrade of your firewalls and you invest in that unified threat management system, if it's you know, the next implementation of a single sign-on solution, you invest in an intelligent identity and threat aware solution. I think if you look at it from that perspective, you're not it's not nothing new. It's just an evolution of some legacy technology. When you talk about network admission control or network access control, which is probably would be that unique additional investment, you know, you can start off by using your host-based firewall to achieve some of this. As you morph into the more dynamic, more evolutionary way to isolate systems. So you can start off by leveraging the existing capabilities you have and invest as you want to, as you evolve the scope of your implementation. So that's the way I see it.
Okay, Brian,
Yeah,
let me
I
give you the
couldn't.
last word. Go.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that it is really just the evolution of your technology. It's closing security holes. It's protecting the data better than you ever have. So, is there a unique cost to zero trust? Well, again, it means different things to different people, and the way you choose to implement it, it could come with a separate cost if you want to put in the Ferrari model of something and you want to be, the absolute best of everything, or if you want to simplify it down to access lists and a few basic things, it doesn't have to cost that much. But I think the strategy, as Solomon laid it out, is the same way I view it, which is you have there's a cost to technology, there's a life cycle cost, there's a roadmap you should already be on technology refresh. If you refresh it at those points, then it's just the next evolution of your technology. So a separate cost for zero trust per se, not necessarily, but that doesn't mean necessarily there's no cost to doing this. There's always a cost to securing IT infrastructure. The question always is if you say you can't afford to secure the IT infrastructure correctly, what's the cost to not doing it? So let me tell you, the amount of money you're going to spend in resources and man hours fixing the problems that's going to be created by that security hole, it's going to cost you much more than if you would have just paid to put the infrastructure in to begin with. So
the opportunity
the cost not to do this is much greater.
Yeah. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and I think we could have kept talking about this one for a long time. So, Brian and Solomon, I've enjoyed the conversation. I've enjoyed your insights. Members of the audience, thank you for participating. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, I think we'd be happy to follow up by email. But I think this has been a good session at sort of getting to the root of some of the FUD surrounding the topic of zero trust. So, thank you all. Stay safe, and I hope to see you all in a non-virtual setting sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Thank you
Gene.
very much.
Brian. Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Solomon.